Ich habe jetzt das Vergnügen, die beiden Vortragenden für unsere Einführungsvorträge kurz vorzustellen. Wir beginnen die Konferenz mit zwei Impulsvorträgen, die einen Rahmen spannen sollen für die weitere Debatte. Zunächst Professor Alistair Ross vom Institute for Policy Studies in Education an der Universität London. Er spricht zur europäischen Identität im 21. Jahrhundert. Ein sehr zwiespältiges Thema, weil Identität gleichzeitig ein Element der Spaltung und Fragmentierung von Gesellschaften sein kann. Und gleichzeitig ist es doch ein notwendiges Element des Zusammenhalts und der Herausbildung einer politischen Gemeinschaft. Deshalb bin ich sehr gespannt auf Ihre Ausführungen, was europäische Identität für Einwanderungsgesellschaften im 21. Jahrhundert bedeuten kann und bedeuten sollte und vielleicht auch was nicht. Und der zweite Vortrag von Professor Hans Enzinger von der Erasmus-Universität Rotterdam dreht sich um Aufstiegsaspirationen und strukturelle Hürden für sozialen Aufstieg von Immigranten, also um die Frage, die von zentraler Bedeutung ist für gelingende Integration, für gelingende Teilhabe in einem sehr umfassenden Sinn. Sie finden in den Tagungsmappen biografische Informationen zu allen Referentinnen und Referenten der Tagung. Ich kann mich deshalb bei der Vorstellung sehr kurz halten. Habe schon erwähnt, dass Professor Alistair Ross Emeritusprofessor für Erziehungswissenschaften an der London Metropolitan University ist. Er hält einen Jean Monnet-Lehrstuhl verliehen durch die Europäische Kommission und entwickelt gegenwärtig eine Studie, arbeitet an einer Studie über die Identitätskonstruktion von jungen Europäern in Ostmitteleuropa und den Kandidatenstaaten für die Europäische Union. Und genau das ist dann die Brücke zu dem Vortrag, den wir gleich hören werden. Bitte sehr, Professor Ross, the floor is yours.
Good morning, and thank you for that introduction. It's a pleasure to be here, an honor to be invited to speak to you. The theme of today's conference, our conference, is migration, integration, and social mobility. And I'm going to look particularly at how education might be able to support the integration and social mobility of migrants and their descendants in the European context. I hope briefly to survey what is meant by social mobility and meritocracy, and how these relate to the development of identities, and from this to examine ideas of social difference, both between individuals and between groups, particularly as they affect migrants. I'll then look at the potential role of education, either to maintain social inertia and reproduce social inequalities, or as a possible agent for transformation. I then want to look at the particular position of migrants and the MIPEC study analysis of the particular barriers that are faced by migrants, and then the implications that these have for teaching of migrants and the concomitant teaching of non-migrants. So to start with social mobility and meritocracy. Why is social mobility important? Many countries in Europe have experienced periods of high social mobility in the past. as social and political reforms have opened up new opportunities for people whose socio-economic backgrounds have previously kept them back. Much of this expansion took place because of the increase in the number of work opportunities in the professions, in business and science in Europe. And at the time this occurred, this social mobility was very real, but it hasn't persisted. European societies are now becoming less mobile. As an example, in the UK, we now find that about 7% of our children attend independent schools, for which their parents pay up to 20,000 euros a year. About 40% of those pupils will gain admittance to the UK's elite universities. Whereas if we look at the children who attend state schools, the children of less well-off parents, only 7% will attend those universities. And of the poorest children attending state schools, those who get free school meals, 2% attend the elite universities. And that pattern is also found in the proportion attending any university. 60% of private school pupils, 33% from middling income families, and just 15% from poor families. The reproduction of social and economic inequity is powerful and is increasing. Pervading all this is the development of the discourse of meritocracy over the past half-century. This is the argument that any system that seeks efficiency should ensure that the best can rise to the top. Appointments are made and responsibilities given to those individuals who can demonstrate best their intelligence and their ability, and these factors are very often assessed by educational performance. A high level of educational performance gives access to positions of power and allows individuals to accumulate more evidence of their intelligence and ability, and denies, or at least hinders access to, such experience to those with lesser levels of performance. This is a particularly insidious argument. It implies that those who don't succeed, even entire groups of people who don't succeed, are themselves responsible for any disadvantage they suffer. It discounts institutional and structural impediments to success and ignores the fact that those who succeed in a meritocracy take steps to ensure that their children will become embedded in structures that will ensure that they succeed regardless of merit. And the term meritocracy was originally conceived and used as a satirical argument against mixing conceptions of equality with notions of merit in the novel The Rise of the Meritocracy by Michael Young. Now, Young was an unusually influential sociologist and social entrepreneur through the entire second half of the 20th century. And this novel in 1956 mockingly points to how an elite selected on merit would inevitably seek to ensure, through arrogance and complacency, that the privileged positions to which they rose would be passed on to their offspring, even though they might well be less talented. His argument was that any attempt to give special status as an elite was being an elite particularly important to society, a creative minority or a restless elite, as he put it, would produce a much larger majority of the disempowered. Every selection of one is the rejection of another, he said. He was, in later life, dismayed to find out that his satirical take on meritocracy had been adopted by politicians. This meritocratic fallacy pervades much of the justification for educational underachievement. It's predicated on the assumption that the principal purpose of an educational system is to filter and to grade individuals' attainment, rather than to equip them with the abilities, the skills, the understanding to become fulfilled members of society. The system is designed to create failures and makes inequality, with all its social consequences, inevitable. Wilkinson and Pickett have shown how these developed societies that have greater and social economic inequalities also have lower rates of good health, lower life expectancy, greater mental health problems, greater drug use, greater obesity, lower educational attainment, more violence, greater levels of imprisonment, and that these rates apply to the richest in an unequal society and not just to the poorest members. So the practice of meritocracy has in many countries created whole social groups that fail, and this institutionalizes and codifies underachievement, offering reassuring rationalizations for social differences and justifying discriminatory practices against social groups, be they social classes, the disabled, or minorities such as migrants. Most educational systems apply, wittingly or unwittingly, structural barriers to access to educational provision that lead to inequalities to particular groups. Restricting access to certain types of schooling, as academic as opposed to vocational, for example, can in practice limit higher status educational streams to members of particular socioeconomic groups. In many cases, an early division of this kind can mean that a child who has started off on a vocational route will find it very difficult to switch to an academic route, if at all. Such early setting into streams has important implications in potentially restricting later access to higher education. There are also pressures of differential expectations of particular groups of pupils being used to affect pupil choice. Commonly given examples of this often concern the entry of girls into scientific and technical subjects, but there are many others, particularly of an ethnic and a migrant nature, where they are assumed that they will not succeed. Now, I'm distinguishing here between individuals and inequalities between individuals and inequalities between groups. There will always be some form of inequality between individuals. How individuals perform and succeed in many aspects of life. And it's important that resources are given to ensuring that significant inequalities are minimised by giving additional support to those individuals who are disadvantaged. And even more important is that a society recognises that everyone has equality in terms of human rights, dignity and esteem. But my focus here today is inequality between groups. That is, where an identifiable population, such as a migrant group, has an overall distribution of performance significantly different from the distribution performance of the mean population. If members of any group are achieving less favourable distribution of educational outcomes than the majority of the population, then I'd argue that it's reasonable to make an initial presumption, at least, that there have been some inequalities in social and educational policies. The objective of policy should be to ensure that all groups within society have similar profiles of attainment. And to achieve this may require differential, that is, unequal, treatment for a particular group. And the onus should be on those who are responsible for educational policy to demonstrate that all necessary policies are in place to achieve this. The fact that various groups continue to suffer educational disadvantage, even though there may be some policies, initiatives to counter this, suggests that whatever the intentions, educational systems institutionally discriminate against the disadvantaged. And the term educational institutional inequality might be usefully employed to identify the collective failure of an educational institution or set of institutions to provide appropriate educational services to a minority group of the population, such as migrants, because of their social, cultural, linguistic or behavioural characteristics. The Belgian sociologist Nicaise suggests that inequalities in education arise from two forms of failure. Failures on the demand side occur when the socioeconomic characteristics of a social group, such as poverty, material or cultural deprivation, health, lack of social or cultural capital, lead to individuals from these groups being unable to take up educational opportunities. Failures on the supply side occur when an educational policy and practice disadvantages members of a group, including the institutional prejudice and inability of institutions to respond to the specific and different needs of particular groups. Each of these structural failings interacts with the other. If the supply-side institutions can't adequately support a group, they create a situation in which members of the group lower their aspirations and expectations of success, and thus make fewer demands on the educational system. If they have lower expectations of success, then educators themselves will also develop expectations that members of the group will fail. And this creates a self-sustaining situation. And there's little value, I think, in debating the primacy of either side of this equation in terms of causation. The circle needs to be broken. The following example highlights the variations in educational outcomes of migrants in different countries. This figure shows, by country, the difference in reading scores attained by the first generation of migrant students, the second generation of migrant students, and the native indigenous population. Now, the key comparison to be made here is not between the comparative scores between countries, but to the extent within each country, first and particularly second-generation migrants approach the country's norm for native students. In most countries, there's Belgium for example, there's only minimal improvements between generations, with substantial difference between the second-generation attainment and the native score. In two countries, Germany and Austria, there's a fall in attainment. Second-generation pupils perform less well than their parents had performed. Only two countries, UK and Sweden, show substantial progress, where the second generation is approaching the level of reading performance of the native population. How is it possible to tell if a particular group is suffering some form of educational inequality? We need to examine educational outcomes rather than only educational opportunities. And what evidence is there of difference between achievement or performance of a group and the prevailing national norm? And this is quite difficult to determine, partly because of the very wide ways in which data is collected in different countries. Studies such as the Programme for International Student Assessment, PISA, do provide some useful data, but in a limited number of areas. And as part of addressing the process of educational inequalities, we need to assess and evaluate not only at the end of a period of compulsory education, but also within this period and before formal education. In terms of migrant achievement, intra-country comparisons are at least as important as cross-country comparisons. So moving on to education as a possibility to transform or a possibility to reproduce social inertia. Teaching is not a neutral activity. Education can reproduce social patterns, as has been argued by Stan Bowles and Herb Gintis, who traced the correspondence between educational structures and policies and the needs of a capitalist society for compliant and motivated workers, by Pierre Bourdieu, who identifies how educational systems privilege and transmit particular forms of social capital, and Michael Appel, who pointed to how educational systems contrive to maintain inequities in power. There's an inherent traditionalism in much educational policy, however much the rhetoric of transformation is employed. Most countries expect the curriculum to maintain and instill what they see as the country's traditional values and views of its history. Education is expected to support and legitimize current political, social and economic norms. And because all adults have been through an educational process, they all see themselves as qualified, by virtue of this experience, to judge what forms and functions education should perform. Change is difficult when politicians, parents and teachers see any proposals for new forms of education as a criticism of the education that has made them what they are. Education and teaching have pivotal roles in the development of the understanding of society. It used to be held that the role of education was actually to do that, to transmit existing social structures, to reproduce social patterns, relationships. A century ago, Durkheim characterized education as being the image and reflection of society. It imitates and reproduces the latter in an abbreviated form. It doesn't create it. Education, then, a mirror to society, reproducing social behaviour, social distinctions and social patterns. I'd argue that we should think of education and teachers as also having the power to transform society and to promote equity and social justice. Teaching can transform and translate society rather than simply reproduce it. It can open new opportunities to individuals and to groups, enhancing their ability to participate in the community, economically, politically, socially. Social exclusion can be lessened, inequities reduced, access to power, influence and involvement increased. And much of this can be achieved by ensuring that the structures of education distribute knowledge, ideas, skills, attitudes in ways that all groups and all classes of people can achieve. Social and civic education in particular can develop particular abilities and attitudes that are especially important for the development of a civic culture amongst young people. And I want to move on to the MIPEX indicators for education, which I was privileged to be involved in devising. They're based on many of the conventions and charters that propose that migrants and their descendants should have equality of access to education, the same as provided for the indigenous or long-term settled population. And also on the fact that access alone is not necessarily sufficient for integration, and they need other policies. MIPEX is looking at policies, not at practices or at outcomes. Practices may differ from policies, outcomes may differ from practices and policies. Policies may determine the framework, but are not the only factor. But we're looking in MIPEX at the policies, the policy situation that attempts to structure that. And as far as the particular position of migrants are concerned, the MIPEX indicators are based on 4 broad policy areas that need to be addressed. The first of these is access to educational provision, which may be constrained by various criteria and thresholds. However, equality of access alone doesn't necessarily lead to equality of outcome. Many reports, such as the graph earlier, identify systematic educational underperformance by migrants. And this suggests that there may be some forms of institutional prejudice that lead to inequalities of outcomes for migrants. Institutional racism can be defined as the collective failure of an organisation to provide an appropriate and professional service to people because of their colour, culture or ethnic origin. It can be seen or detected in processes, attitudes and behaviour which amount to discrimination through unwitting prejudice, ignorance, thoughtlessness, racist stereotyping which disadvantage minority ethnic people. The word unwitting there is important. You don't have to mean to be racist to behave in a racist way. You don't have to mean to discriminate against migrants to do so. It's the outcomes of policies that become significant, not just the policy intentions, however high they seek to aim. In this instance, the fact that migrants do not all achieve similar educational outcomes suggests that simply accessing educational provision is insufficient, and many educational institutions in Europe are institutionally discriminating against migrants. So the second policy area there is about policies that target the specific needs of migrants to produce equalities of outcomes. Specific additional policies designed to ensure that migrants achieve and gain equal qualifications and opportunities for employment. But to return to my earlier references to meritocracies, education is more than simply utilitarian access to qualifications to employment. It's also concerned with developing and sustaining social values and human rights. So the third and fourth policy foci are policies that support intercultural understanding and values and to sustain a harmonious and diverse society, some of which may include maintaining migrants' cultural identities. The third policy area, then, that we suggest is about educational policies that specifically provide for new opportunities in supporting migrants in the broader community, both helping integration and supporting cultural identity. These will take place in a broader range of institutions than formal educational settings, and include community-based activities and those directed at adults. These 3 first foci are all concerned with policies directed at the migrant population itself. The fourth area we suggest is a group of educational policies that are directed at the population as a whole, to promote the values of the valuing of diversity in society, in the population as a whole. Educational policy and provision should reflect the populations it serves. When you add migrants to the population mix, this should therefore change educational provision. To what extent is intercultural education or citizenship education that addresses populations as a whole and population diversity provided? What curricular changes have been made to ensure that the whole population has an appreciation of diversity and difference? So those are the 4 strands, and I want to now examine each of those strands in a bit more detail. First of all, access to educational provision. There are many conventions and charters that require states to make educational provision available to all as a universal right. Some of these specify that the rights are also meant to include migrants and their children. However, some states attempt to exclude children for whom they feel a bit less responsible in some way, such as those of migrants. And the same is true of non-statutory provision, either preschool or to further and higher education, where particular residency qualifications may prevent equality of access. Where higher and further education isn't free, migrants may be discriminated against, for example, in the levels of fees charged, or the residency qualifications giving eligibility for the same fee rates as nationals. Migrants can also be discriminated against in their access to vocational training, which is particularly important to economic migrants who need to maintain their vocational skill levels. They need access to vocational training at least as good as that of the general workforce, as well as the general learning opportunities. And the recognition and qualification of qualifications and education and training prior to migration is also of critical importance to a migrant's ability to be economically successful and to integrate. But access is not enough on its own. We also need policies that target the equality of attainment, not merely the equality of provision in education. And this strand covers all those educational policies that are intended to ensure that migrants succeed in their education. Within the provision of mainstream education services, there may be some cultural or linguistic barriers that inhibit migrants' ability to use these provisions, and additional supports and adjustments may be necessary. Many countries have educational systems that divide pupils into, for example, academic and vocational streams at a relatively early age, often before migrant children have had the opportunity to acquire the linguistic and other skills to fully demonstrate their potential. What opportunities are there to transfer between streams that could allow migrants equal access to different pathways? An essential prerequisite to ensuring equality of outcomes between different groups, migrant and non-migrant, is the collection and analysis of reliable statistics about the performance and progress of learners through the system. Remember that migrants themselves are not a homogeneous group. There's a diversity within migrant groups. Migrancy is a status, not an identity, and different migrant groups will perform in different ways at different times in their educational histories. If we have accurate statistics of performance for different migrant groups, it enables policymakers to determine if inequalities exist, their extent, at what point they occur and for what reason, and also, and importantly, it allows for the targeted provision of resources to ameliorate and remedy the inequality, and hopefully to measure the success of that attempt. And we also need particular teaching training programs on the needs of migrants and on teacher expectations. I spoke before about expectations. If a teacher has expectations that a particular child, or more importantly, a particular group of children will not succeed, it is almost inevitable that that child, that group, will not succeed. Unless teachers have high expectations of success from migrant groups will not succeed. Thirdly, educational policies that provide for migrants in the broader community, cultural maintenance. These include support measures to assist newcomer students to integrate into the school system, and programs for adults that promote the active participation of newcomer adults in society, including the labour market. There's widespread agreement that these programs are needed to ensure migrants and their families have access to learning the language of the host country, necessary condition for integration. But this isn't a sufficient condition, and other educational policies may also be necessary. For example, education about the host country's culture, education about the host country's language, and other areas of policy provision to support migrants maintain their identity through their language and culture, if that's what they wish. Successful integration doesn't require cultural homogeneity, and migrants may wish to develop institutions such as supplementary schools where their children are supported in maintaining the culture and heritage of their own culture. And finally, policies directed at supporting intercultural education for the whole population. And I think there's a lot of agreement and support for general intercultural education and for educational policies that support tolerance, the recognition of diversity, and valuing of diversity, and measures that counter racism and xenophobia. There's also support, less widespread, to ensure that school institutions and practices are adapted to accommodate diverse cultural patterns, or that the necessary changes take place in the social composition of in the curriculum to reflect changes in the social composition of the population. Finally, and importantly, I suggest that we also need policies to recruit teachers and other educational professionals from the migrant communities themselves, because the presence of these teachers sends strong markers about interculturality and equality to the population as a whole. Teaching must be carried out by a wide and diverse group of people. I suggest that the teaching profession needs to be representative of any country's minorities. It matters enormously if the teaching profession has very few teachers from the ethnic minorities and migrant groups. There are 4 particular characteristics of schooling that make this essential. First of all, learning is a formative activity, conducted through a variety of processes, some of which are explicit, some of which are almost invisible. The process of learning conveys meanings, and who conducts this process is an important part of the process itself. Secondly, learning is a social process, located in institutions and interactions between teacher and learner, and learner. Designating a person as a teacher is not lightly undertaken and conveys important messages to society and to parents, and above all to children, in deciding who will be a teacher. Thirdly, learning is undertaken by all children and young people. Most of our other social provisions are episodic and accidental. The number of times a child meets a police officer, a doctor, a nurse, a social worker, is relatively infrequent for nearly all our children. Teachers they meet all the time. And it is a long time. Fourthly, learning is conducted over a long period of time, 12 years or more. And these 4 characteristics make it very important whom we entrust to teach. A representative balance of teachers is critical because the character, the ubiquity, the pervasiveness, the duration and the importance of teaching as a social activity. Teachers as a profession must have the capacity to reflect the full spectrum of social and cultural traditions and systems in their professional collective practice. Every individual teacher brings to his or her work a set of cultural norms and expectations, and good teachers are reflective and self-critically aware of this. But none of us can recognise all the culturally and socially determined habits that we carry. Teachers are a very special and specific particular category. They are the one face of civil society that every child will meet every working day through the whole of their formal education. And it's therefore particularly critical that this face of our civil power be seen visibly and explicitly to represent all of our society. This is where such inclusiveness is essential. These are the policy measures I suggest are necessary to ensure that educational practices ensure social mobility and social justice for our minorities, migrants and others. Social progress for individuals and for groups is possible, despite the inherent tendency of educational policies to reproduce inequality. But to achieve this, we need to constantly be aware of and to counter these tendencies. Thank you.